"Please, I need a man's warmth," Apache girl whispered to the loner rancher. The loner rancher had lived in solitude for as long as he could remember. His ranch lay far from the nearest town, surrounded by endless stretches of land that seemed to blend into the horizon. His days were filled with hard work, mending fences, caring for cattle, and tending to the barn. But the work, though fulfilling, could never replace the human connections he had lost over the years. He had once known love, once felt the warmth of companionship. But that was long ago. Time had a way of stripping away what was once dear to him. His wife, his family. One by one they had drifted away or passed on. He never blamed anyone for it. Life was hard, and people moved on when they couldn't endure the struggles that came with a life in the wild. He understood that. But it left him feeling hollow. The ranch, the land, the animals. They became his only company. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, he would sit on the porch of his small cabin, staring into the distance. The wind would rustle through the tall grasses, and the silence would settle over him like a heavy blanket. Past. At times he could almost hear the echoes of voices from his past, his wife's laughter, the chatter of children running around the yard, but those days were gone. The cold, lonely nights had become a routine. The rancher didn't mind the quiet at first. It was all he had known for so long. But as the years passed, it began to weigh on him. He would often look up at the stars, wondering if somewhere, beyond the vastness of the open plains, there were others who understood the loneliness he felt. He would shake his head and laugh at the thought. He was a simple man, accustomed to working hard and surviving off the land. He didn't need anyone. At least, that's what he told himself. One particular evening after a long day of repairing the barn roof, he felt the familiar ache in his muscles. His hands were rough from years of labor, and the weight of his solitude was heavier than ever. The evening sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. He had just finished securing the barn doors when he heard a faint rustling sound in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind. But then the sound came again, faint but unmistakable. Someone was out there. The rancher paused, listening carefully. He stood still, his boots planted firmly in the dirt, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew this land well. There was no one else for miles. The nearest town was a good day's ride away, and anyone who wandered out here had to have a reason.
His mind raced as he considered the possibilities.
Had someone gotten lost? Was there trouble? He cautiously stepped toward the edge of the property, keeping to the shadows. The wind had died down, and the world around him seemed unusually quiet, as though holding its breath. He listened intently, and then he saw her. A figure, barely visible in the fading light, stumbled slowly toward him. It was a girl, no more than a young woman, dressed in worn clothing and barely able to stand. Her face was pale, and her hair hung loosely around her shoulders, tangled and windblown. She was thin, her body shaking as if she had been walking for days without rest. The rancher's heart quickened, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his voice rough as he called out, "Hey! Are you all right?" The girl stopped, looking up at him through wide, exhausted eyes. She didn't speak, just stared at him, as if unsure of whether he was real or just another part of her fading consciousness. The rancher took a cautious step closer, keeping his distance. He didn't know what to expect from a stranger, especially one who had wandered so far from civilization. "Hey, you're safe now," he said, his tone softer this time. He knew he had to approach her carefully. She looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who was running from something. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that only comes from a life lived on the edge, always looking over your shoulder. "Come on, I'll get you inside."
"You must be freezing." The girl didn't say anything at first, just nodded weakly, too tired to argue. She followed him as he led her toward the barn, her steps slow and unsteady. The rancher opened the door and gestured for her to go inside.
The warmth of the barn greeted them, and for a moment the girl hesitated. She looked around, as if unsure of where she was or whether it was safe to stay. The rancher set about lighting a small fire in the corner, the crackling sound filling the silence. As the flames began to grow, he turned to her. "You look like you've been on the road for a while. What happened? Where did you come from?" The girl shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Breath. She seemed lost, as though she didn't know how to begin. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I need a man's warmth." The rancher frowned, confused by her words. He wasn't sure what she meant, but something in her tone struck him. It was a quiet plea, one that spoke of desperation, of a need that went beyond mere survival. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, understanding that she wasn't asking for anything more than the simple comfort of being safe, of being cared for, if only for a little while. He moved to the fire, grabbing an old blanket from a nearby shelf and handing it to her. She wrapped it around herself with shaky hands, her eyes still distant. The rancher watched her closely, sensing there was much more to her story than she was letting on. He didn't push her to talk, knowing that trust couldn't be forced.
It had to be earned. As she sat by the fire, her shoulders slowly relaxed, and the tension in her face began to soften.
For a brief moment, the rancher saw a glimpse of peace in her eyes, peace that had been absent for too long. It was a reminder to him of how fragile life could be, how quickly things could change, and how even the hardest of souls needed warmth, needed connection, needed someone to care. The girl closed her eyes, and the rancher remained silent, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she ended up here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? But for now, all he could do was offer her the only thing he had left to give, the warmth of a fire, the shelter of his barn, and the quiet company of a man who, despite everything, still remembered what it meant to care for another. As the days passed, the rancher found himself growing more curious about the girl. She hadn't said much about herself since that first night, only offering brief responses when asked. But there was something in her silence that spoke volumes. She was clearly exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was a strength to her that intrigued him. She had managed to survive out there, on her own, for who knew how long. But there was a sadness in her eyes that seemed to never leave. She had settled into a small corner of the barn, a place she claimed as her own. It wasn't much, just some hay and a blanket, but it was warm and safe, at least for now. The rancher didn't ask her to do anything. He didn't expect her to work. He simply offered her what he could, a place to rest, a meal when she was hungry, and silence when she needed it.
He knew better than to press her to talk about her past.
In the silence between them, there was an unspoken understanding. Every day, the rancher went about his chores as usual, but now he found his thoughts often drifting back to the girl. He would glance over at her from time to time, watching her as she sat by the fire or looked out at the open fields, her gaze distant and lost. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was in quiet, hesitant words. But the more he observed her, the more he realized how deeply she had been affected by whatever had led her to this point. One evening, as the sun began to set and the cold of the night started to creep in, the rancher sat by the fire with a cup of coffee in his hands. The girl had been quiet that day, more so than usual. He could see that she was lost in thought, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just fear. It was something darker, something that had been haunting her long before she arrived at his ranch. He had never been good with words, but he knew that silence could be as much of a comfort as any conversation, so he didn't push her to talk. But as he sat there, he felt an overwhelming urge to know her story, not out of curiosity, but out of a desire to understand her, to help her find the peace she seemed to desperately need. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" he asked quietly, his voice soft as he spoke across the fire to her.
The girl didn't look at him immediately.
She continued to stare at the flames, as though they held the answers she was looking for. It seemed like she was weighing his words, deciding whether or not to speak. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were filled with pain, but there was also something else, something fragile that he hadn't noticed before. "I wasn't always like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't always feel lost." The rancher didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, urging her to continue with his eyes.
"My people, my tribe." Her words faltered for a moment. She was struggling to find the right ones, the ones that wouldn't break her.
They've been through so much. We've been through so much. I thought I could be strong enough to carry it all." She paused again as if collecting the fragments of a past that had left her broken. The rancher watched her carefully, waiting. He could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, and he knew that this was the first time she was sharing any part of her story. "But sometimes it's too much," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The weight of it all, the fighting, the losing. I couldn't carry it anymore. I couldn't carry it for them. I couldn't carry it for them." Berate. "So I left." She swallowed hard, as if the simple act of saying it aloud was harder than she had imagined. The rancher's heart went out to her. He could see now that her silence wasn't just the result of fear. It was the result of grief for her people, for the life she had left behind, and for the weight of a history that she couldn't escape.
Where did you go? He asked softly, not wanting to push her too hard, but needing to know.
She shook her head slowly, her eyes clouded with memories she wished she could forget. "I don't know. Just away. Away from everything. I thought if I just ran far enough, I could forget it all. But it didn't work that way." "You can't just outrun your past." The rancher remained quiet, allowing her to collect her thoughts. He knew better than to rush her. It was clear that there were many layers to her story, layers that were still too painful for her to reveal all at once. "I came here because I was tired," she said after a long pause, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know where else to go. I didn't want to go back. I didn't know what else to do." Desk. The rancher felt a pang of empathy in his chest. He had lived a long time with his own burdens, his own memories of loss and regret, but he had never had to carry what she had. He knew that words weren't enough to heal her, but he also knew that he couldn't let her slip back into the darkness that she had come from. She needed time, and perhaps, just perhaps, she needed someone to show her that not all was lost.
"You're safe here," the rancher said gently, offering her a small, reassuring smile.
"For as long as you need to stay, you're safe here." The girl looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with uncertainty. It was as if she couldn't believe the words he had said.
She had been running for so long, and the idea of safety, of peace, was foreign to her. But something in his tone seemed to comfort her, if only for a moment.
"Thank you," she whispered, almost too softly for him to hear. "Thank you for not asking more." "For not pushing me." The rancher nodded.
He understood. Some things couldn't be forced.
Some stories had to be told in their own time. For now he was content with just being there for her, quietly offering what little he could. A warm fire, a safe place to rest, and a promise that she wouldn't have to face it all alone.
As the fire crackled between them, the rancher sat back, letting the silence stretch comfortably around them. It was a silence that spoke of understanding, of a bond that was beginning to form, not through words, but through shared experience. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. And for the girl, perhaps this small gesture, this simple act of kindness, was the beginning of her own healing. The night stretched on, and the wind outside began to howl louder, as if the land itself was trying to speak to them. But inside the barn, there was peace.
Quiet. A place for both of them to breathe. The days went by slowly, each one blending into the next like the pages of a book left too long on a shelf.
For the rancher, his routine had remained unchanged, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and tending to the barn. But there was a new presence in his life now, a quiet presence that, over time, began to seep into his heart. The girl, who had arrived so unexpectedly, had become a part of his days in a way he hadn't anticipated.
At first, he had offered her shelter, food, and warmth.
He had treated her like any other guest, polite but distant. He knew nothing about her, and the last thing he wanted to do was make her feel like she owed him anything. But as the days stretched into weeks, he began to notice the small changes in her. She had started to eat more, her face no longer as pale, and her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, had softened, even if only a little. She still didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was stronger. The quiet way she had once carried herself had given way to a gentle calmness, like a stream that had found its own path after a long journey. Every evening, after the day's work was done, they would sit by the fire. The rancher, who had always preferred his solitude, found himself looking forward to these quiet moments with the girl. The crackling flames between them created a bond, even in silence. She would sit on the edge of the firelight, her legs drawn up to her chest, staring into the flames as if they held some secret. One evening, after they had finished eating, the rancher sat back in his chair and watched her. She had grown more comfortable here, but there was still something about her that seemed distant, as if a part of her was still far away. He couldn't blame her for that. She had been through a lot, and he knew that no amount of food or shelter could erase the memories of what she had left behind. Pace. He had never been one to ask personal questions. He wasn't that kind of man. But something inside him urged him to break the silence, to ask her more about herself. After all, they had spent weeks together now. The least he could do was show her that he cared.
"How did you end up out there?" he asked, his voice gentle. The girl didn't look at him right away.
She continued to stare into the fire, her eyes distant. Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt beneath her as she considered his question. He waited patiently, not rushing her.
He could tell she wasn't used to talking about her past, but he didn't want to push her too hard.
But finally, after a long pause, she spoke.
"I left because I couldn't stay,"
she said, her voice low and steady.
"There was nothing left for me there.
everything I knew, everything I believed in. Breaths. It was gone. It wasn't safe anymore. Breath. The rancher didn't press for more details. He simply nodded, as if to show that he understood. Breath. She hadn't said much, but her words spoke volumes. It was clear now that she had fled from something far more complicated than mere hunger or cold.
I thought I could run away from it all, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. But running doesn't change anything.
It doesn't erase what's inside. The rancher felt a pang of sadness for her. He had never known that kind of pain. He had his own share of loss, his own quiet battles, but he couldn't imagine what it was like to carry such a heavy burden on the inside.
"You're not running anymore," he said quietly, looking at her.
"You're here now. You're safe."
She glanced at him for the first time that evening, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For a moment they just stared at each other, two strangers who had found something in each other's company.
The girl's gaze softened, and she nodded, as if the weight of his words had settled on her heart. She didn't say anything more, but there was a shift in the air between them. She seemed to breathe a little easier, her shoulders less tense. Over the next few days, the girl began to open up more, bit by bit. She still didn't speak much about her past, but she started to share small stories about the life she had left behind. I had been once lived in harmony with the land, how they had once lived in harmony with the land, how they had shared everything. Her father had been a strong leader, someone who had protected his people with pride. Burst. Her mother had been kind and gentle, a woman who always had a story to tell. But the peace they had known had been shattered. She spoke of the hardships that had come with the changing world, how outsiders had come to their land, seeking control, taking what wasn't theirs. The girl's voice was steady as she recounted the destruction that had torn apart everything she had once known. She didn't go into details, but the sorrow in her eyes told him all he needed to know. The rancher listened, offering no judgments, only quiet understanding. He could see how much the girl had suffered, how much she still carried with her. There were parts of her past that she would never be able to forget, and he knew that. But as the days passed, he could see her beginning to heal. Slowly, but surely. She was starting to trust him, to let go of the walls she had built around herself. Bus. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, the girl turned to him with a hesitant expression. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I haven't been much help around here. You've done so much for me, and I don't know how to repay you." The rancher looked at her surprised. He hadn't expected her to feel like she owed him anything. He had never helped her because he expected something in return. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because she had needed it. "You don't owe me anything," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. "You're here. That's enough. You don't have to repay me. Just take your time. Desk, heal, but that's all I want for you." The girl's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rancher didn't need any grand gestures or grand words. He was content knowing that, little by little, she was beginning to find herself again. As the days turned to weeks, the rancher found that the quiet presence of the girl had become a comforting part of his life. She still didn't speak much, but her presence spoke volumes. There was something unspoken between them, a connection that was growing, even without words. The rancher had always been a man of few words. But with her, he didn't need many. They understood each other in ways that didn't require explanations. And for the girl, the ranch had become more than just a place to escape to. It had become a place where she could begin to heal, where she could feel safe and slowly start to build the trust she had lost. There was no rushing the process, but with each passing day, she felt a little more whole, a little more ready to face whatever came next. The weeks turned into months, and the seasons began to shift once again. The cold winds of winter had given way to the warmth of spring breeze. The rancher had grown accustomed to the sound of the girl's quiet steps around the barn, her presence no longer an unexpected intrusion, but a natural part of his life. He had never imagined that someone could become so important to him so quickly. Yet here they were, two people who had started as strangers, now bound by the unspoken understanding of shared silence and shared hardship. The girl had started to change. She was no longer just the quiet woman who sat in the corner, her eyes distant, lost in her memories. Now she moved around the barn with purpose, helping him with small tasks when she was able. At first she had been hesitant, unsure of her place, unsure if she was truly allowed to contribute. But the rancher had never expected her to do much. He hadn't brought her here to work. He had brought her here because she needed peace, a place to heal. Still, little by little she began to take on more. She helped with feeding the animals, gathering firewood, and even worked beside him in the fields when the weather allowed. Her body had regained strength, and so had her spirit. She had found something in herself that she had lost long ago, a sense of purpose. She no longer seemed to carry the same heavy burden of fear and sorrow that had once followed her wherever she went. There was a quiet lightness in her now, a softness in her smile that hadn't been there before. Despite all the changes, the rancher never asked her to open up more about her past. He didn't need to know every detail. He could see that she was healing, and that was enough for him. In his eyes, she wasn't defined by what she had been through. She was someone who had endured, someone who had fought for her survival. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the land, the rancher found himself taking a break from his work. He sat on the porch of his cabin, leaning back in his chair, watching the girl as she worked in the garden. She was planting seeds for the coming season, her hands moving with the kind of care and focus that only someone who had learned the value of patience could possess. The rancher smiled to himself, appreciating the way she had found joy in the simplest of tasks. It wasn't until she finished and turned back toward the house that she saw him sitting there. She gave him a small wave, a gesture so simple, yet it filled him with a warmth he hadn't expected.
"You're getting good at this," he said with a teasing smile. She laughed softly, the sound like a soft breeze on a warm day.
"I had to learn. The garden was too wild for me to leave it like that."
The rancher chuckled and motioned for her to come sit with him. "Come take a break. You've been working hard."
She hesitated for a moment, but then walked over to join him on the porch. She sat beside him, resting her hands on her knees as she looked out at the land, her gaze taking in the familiar sights. It had become a part of her now, this place. It wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was home. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"The life you had before?" The rancher thought for a moment before responding.
He had lived a life of solitude for so long that it was hard to remember what it had been like to have someone beside him, to share his thoughts and dreams with another person. But he had never truly been unhappy, not in the way she had been. He had always found comfort in the land, in the quiet work that kept him busy. "I don't know if I miss the life I had," he said slowly.
"I miss the company sometimes, but I've always been more of a solitary man. I suppose I've learned to make peace with it."
She nodded as though she understood. There was a deep wisdom in her now, a quiet strength that had come from facing everything she had. It wasn't something you could learn from a book or be taught by others. It was something that came with time, with experience, and with survival.
"I think that's the hardest part," she said softly, her eyes downcast.
Learning to make peace with it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget everything I left behind.
The rancher's heart went out to her. He knew the weight of the past was not something easily carried, and it seemed as if she had been running from it for so long.
He didn't try to offer her false comfort, nor did he try to tell her that time would heal everything. He knew that wasn't true. Bryce, healing wasn't something that happened overnight. But he did know this. Sometimes peace came not from forgetting, but from learning to live with what you could never change. You don't have to forget, he said gently, but maybe over time you can learn to live with it. It doesn't have to control you.
She looked at him, her eyes softening.
For a moment, she didn't say anything. But the look in her eyes told him that she was beginning to understand what he meant. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a quick fix. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for her. A way to embrace the future without being forever held captive by the past. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the sun sink lower in the sky, the colors shifting from gold to pink to purple as the day came to a close. There was no need for more words. The quiet between them felt comfortable, peaceful. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. As the evening drew near and the cool air of dusk began to settle in, the rancher stood up from his chair, stretching his stiff muscles.
"Come on," he said with a smile.
"I'll fix us some dinner. We've earned it." The girl stood as well, offering him a small smile in return.
"I'll help," she said, her voice light. "I've learned a few things here."
The rancher nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that wasn't just from the fire or the evening meal. It was a warmth that came from knowing that, despite everything that had brought them here, they had found something together. Something real. Something that didn't need to be spoken, but was understood in every glance, every gesture. As they walked toward the cabin side by side, the rancher knew that the girl's journey wasn't over, and neither was his. But together they had found a sense of peace that neither of them had expected. They had found something that neither the land nor the hardships of their past could take away. And for the first time in a long time, the rancher allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something that would continue to grow, just as the seeds in the garden would bloom in their own time. The days continued to pass, and the seasons began to change once more. The ranch was no longer just a place of solitude for the rancher. It had become a home in every sense of the word, a place where both he and the girl had found not just shelter, but a sense of belonging. The quiet life he had once known had been transformed by her presence, and though he had never expected it, he found that he had come to care for her in a way he had never thought possible. The girl, too, had changed. She had gone from being a lost and frightened soul, uncertain of her place in the world, to someone who had begun to take ownership of her life. She had found strength in the ranch, in the simple acts of daily life, feeding the animals, working the land, and sitting by the fire at night. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow and uncertainty, now reflected a quiet peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting the past. It was the peace that came from accepting it, from understanding that the past could never be erased, but it didn't have to control her future. The rancher watched her one afternoon as she worked in the garden, her hands moving expertly through the soil as she planted new seeds for the coming season. There was a sense of purpose in her movements now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there when she first arrived. It was as if she had finally found a place where she could put down roots, both literally and figuratively. For the first time in a long time, the rancher saw hope in her eyes. He leaned against the fence, watching her from a distance. A part of him still couldn't believe how far she had come since that first day, when she had stumbled onto his land, shivering and lost. The journey she had made, both physically and emotionally, was one that could not be measured in mere days or weeks. It had taken time, patience, and a great deal of strength. And now, as he watched her work, he realized that he, too, had changed in ways he hadn't fully understood until this moment. The loneliness that had once defined his life had faded. It hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced with something deeper, something that ran through his bones like a quiet current. The rancher had never expected to find someone to share his life with, someone who could make the silence feel less heavy, the work feel less solitary. But the girl had done that, and so much more. As the evening approached, the rancher walked toward the barn, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple. The girl had finished her work in the garden and was now sitting on the porch, looking out at the horizon. He paused for a moment, watching her. It was as though she had found a place for herself here, a place where she could simply be. When she noticed him, she stood up and smiled. It was a soft smile, one that was no longer tinged with uncertainty, but full of warmth.
"It's a beautiful evening," she said, her voice light.
"It is," the rancher agreed, his voice steady. He walked over to where she stood, and for a moment they simply stood side by side, looking out at the land.
It was a familiar scene now, one that had become a part of their shared existence. But this time, there was something different about it. Something had changed between them, something that neither of them had expected, but both had felt. The girl glanced at him, a question in her eyes. "Do you ever think about what's next? About the future?" The rancher looked at her for a moment, surprised by the question. He had never been one to dwell on the future.
His life had always been about the present, about the land, the work, and the quiet rhythm of his daily routine. But as he looked at her, he realized that the future had already begun to unfold in front of him.
It wasn't something that needed to be planned or figured out. It was already here, in the small, everyday moments they shared.
"I've never been one to think too much about the future," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "I've always just taken things as they come."
But maybe that's changing now. Maybe there's more to think about. The girl nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. Rust. She had spent so much of her life running from the future, from the things that had hurt her, from the memories that she couldn't erase. But here, in this place, she had begun to realize that the future didn't have to be something to fear. It was something that could be shaped, something that could be built from the ground up. And maybe, just maybe, it was something she could share with someone else. They stood there for a long time, the silence between them comfortable, not awkward. There was no need for more words. The rancher knew that the future would come, whether they were ready for it or not. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. But the future could wait. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, the rancher found himself thinking about how much had changed. But in himself, he had spent so many years alone, convinced that solitude was all he needed. But now, with the girl by his side, he realized that he had been wrong. There was more to life than just surviving.
There was living. There was sharing the small moments, the quiet moments, and knowing that you weren't alone in them.
As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, more natural than it had ever been before. They talked about the things they had seen in their lives, the places they had been, and the dreams they had once had.
It wasn't heavy talk. It wasn't about the past or the pain. It was just
simple, uncomplicated life. After dinner, they went outside, sitting on the porch and watching the stars as the night settled in.
The air was cool, but the fire inside the house kept them warm. The girl leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed, her face relaxed. The rancher glanced at her, taking in the peaceful expression on her face. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The girl turned to him, her eyes soft.
Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we had met earlier?
The rancher smiled, a small, wistful smile.
I don't know, but I'm glad we met when we did. She smiled back, and in that moment the weight of everything they had both been through seemed to fade into the background.
There was only the present, their shared space, their shared time, and the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The rancher knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, still things they had to face, but for the first time in a long while he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready to face the future, whatever it might bring. And for the girl, he knew that she had found something too. Not just peace, but hope. Hope for the future. Hope for herself. And together they would walk that road, side by side, knowing that the future wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace.